the idea that Hayek and others have used a spontaneous order, that there are kind of systems that kind of coordinate, or there are features of the system that coordinate it without there actually being a single coordinator.
My guest today is Andrew Norton, who is sometime Professor in the Practice of Higher Education Policy at the Australian National University. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks, Ron.
How long have you been a classical liberal?
I think since my late teenage years, so...
That recently?
Indeed, I'm very young. So what happened was, I was about to start studying economics at school in Victoria. I saw in a bookshop a copy of Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose, which said he'd won the Nobel Prize for Economics. I thought this would help me with my economics subjects at school. Didn't really, but it did sort of open what I call the classical liberal tradition to me, and that led to a much wider range of readings, which sort of gave my intuitive perceptions of the world a kind of more coherent frame.
Well, what from your point of view is classical liberalism, Andrew?
Well, I guess in some ways the classical is trying to distinguish it from other versions of liberalism, which are kind of a broad church person, which are part of the liberal tradition. But I think certain modesty about what we can know about the world, maybe not the overconfidence of some sort of even libertarian or more left-wing liberalisms that this is the way to proceed. Belief in the rule of law, tolerance, I think is a particularly important value, so tolerance of views you don't necessarily share yourself. To me, it's sort of a collection of institutions as much as any one foundational principle.
You started by mentioning modesty in knowledge and what could be achieved. Go and unpack that a little for us.
So some of this is coming from sort of the Hayekian perspective, but it's also, I think...
Referring to Friedrich Hayek.
Friedrich Hayek, sorry. But also has parallels with a lot of conservative thinkers as well. And this is, the world is an extremely complex place. People have very complex motivations. It's actually quite hard to predict, what effects different reforms will have. It's quite hard to use that knowledge in a centralised way, sort of the classic critique of central planning in the economy. And so essentially it is, trying to use some of the bottom-up forms of knowledge to coordinate society in the economy rather than a more top-down
Bottom-up forms of knowledge?
In terms of, taking what people know about their lives, as, seen in their practices, as seen in their consumer choices, rather than necessarily, imposing a holistic vision on the whole society.
So you don't believe in the old adage, those who fail to plan to fail in terms of
Not
society?
really. So, in some ways, it's the idea that Hayek and others have used a spontaneous order, that there are kind of systems that kind of coordinate, or there are features of the system that coordinate it without there actually being a single coordinator.
And because you're modest in the claims of anyone knowing anything, therefore a government can't know enough to get everything right, and therefore it ought to share decisions as far as possible with the wide. That's
and
your
that's
point.
kind of why democracy, even though democracy as a popular idea emerges after liberalism, I think the two ideas have a lot of synergies because of that same aspect to it.
That means that liberalism, as you understand it, is a kind of somewhat quiet approach to life, pragmatic, not dogmatic, and not that exciting even. You can't use that language.
Maybe. Like, it's modesty about ourselves as well. So, I've always been a political pragmatist. In some ways that fits because if you're introducing radical policies, to some extent you are taking a leap into the unknown, and to do things more incrementally or experimentally before you commit, I think helps mitigate some of those risks, learn from what you have experienced in the first phase. So I think these things, maybe they are a bit dull, they're not going to stop one big principle that's going to inspire you through all your life, but I think it's been a pretty successful philosophy. These institutions have actually largely maintained themselves with ups and downs for significant periods of time.
So you said earlier, not so much an ideology as institutions. Can you unpack that a little bit?
It's more to sort of sidestep some of the particular reasons why, say, people might support tolerance or the rule of law or a market economy, trying to insist that all comes from one foundational principle such as liberty, I think in some ways misstates the historical reality of how these systems emerged, and also means that for people to accept it, they need to buy into a much broader set of ideas, which they possibly wouldn't do, and I think is unnecessary to the argument.
So you're saying that you believe in that modest liberalism, classical liberalism, basically because it works rather than because it can be deduced from first principles.
Yeah, I'm kind of, in some ways, against first principles thinking.
You're a non-foundationalist.
Non-foundationalist, to use the terms in
philosophical
political
language,
theory. Yeah. So, in fact, someone like John Gray, who, English political theorist, has gone through numerous different phases. But when I was reading him in the late 80s and early 1990s, it was kind of very interesting to watch him because he had sort of gone between liberal thinkers, sort of thinking he'd found the answer in each one, and then changing his mind. And I think he eventually got to this kind of non-foundationalist position, at least by the early 90s, but I think it's more or less correct.
Is that a kind of willful blindness, though, to ask, I'm not going to even ask the question of why this is true or what this is based on, it just is?
No, I think it's important to try and understand why it works the way it does. It's important to try and draw the general lessons, which might then turn into a kind of a principle of sorts that you apply, without thinking there's any single one explainer of everything.
Let me put you at this proposal. When people have tried to impose liberalism, hasn't this led to problems? I'm thinking of the so-called neoliberal experiment of the 90s and the 2000s and the GFC that followed, attempts to make Iraq into a liberal democracy. There's a lot of concern that liberals have, rather than being modest, have been overly self-confident.
I think there is definitely an element of liberalism that is overly self-confident, that they do know the answer, which is kind of why I have some sympathy for some of the conservative thinkers who say, maybe not, maybe be less radical. I think Iraq is kind of an interesting example of, if you take the view that liberalism in some way emerges out of European society at a particular time, and then its principles deduced from successful institutions, there's this big question about to what extent other countries have the cultural preconditions of it.
Thank you. That's a very important question that we've noticed in this series. Some seem to have the view that liberalism is the natural state of human beings. If only we could remove all these limits, the natural liberal would emerge, versus the belief that it's a contingent way of life, contingent upon certain issues that arose in European society in the 17th, 18th centuries, with its certain backgrounds, both in classical world and even in Christendom. Certain cultural, that these are crucial foundations historically of liberalism. You'd hold that view, that it's
definitely,
that it's contingent and historically focused.
Certainly Christianity, I think, is, even though it didn't intend to create a liberal society, through various the beliefs and practices of the church or churches, I think it's not coincidence that liberalism emerges in Western Europe.
Even I've heard this argument. I think it's got a great deal in it, that the classical Christian doctrines of man made the image of God and so forth have led long term. Well, it's taken a while. The irony is that many of the liberal revolutions were in a sense in revolt or in rebellion against overt church power and so forth in Europe. It was king and altar that were often, with the liberals, liberalism was in a sense arose to overcome.
Indeed, and you could argue there's a huge paradox there. I think you also see different kind of liberalisms in different parts of Europe. So in France, the church is the enemy, and therefore they're quite anti-religious. Whereas I think in Britain that was much less so, and therefore you haven't had the kind of, perhaps until the 20th century, a version of liberalism which is sort of strongly antagonistic to the church.
Yes, indeed. Now this would mean that for liberalism to survive, it needs a cultural context.
I think it does, yeah. It's not
as well as institutions, that cultural context. Now, do you think that cultural context is in danger in any way? In other words, is liberalism itself in danger as Western society evolves?
I think there are dangers when some of these practices are no longer observed. I think, I'm not saying it's an immediate crisis, but I think the decline of tolerance in some Western societies is an example of that. You could argue, that in some ways liberalism partly emerges out of kind of the wars of religion, and after a while everyone thinks, well, rather than just killing each other all the time, why don't we just put up with each other instead?
I really believe that this is what Francis Fukuyama in his book Liberalism and Discontents makes very clear. It's a way, it may not be the best way, but it's a way to deal with irreducible pluralism.
Exactly, yeah, and someone like Isaiah Berlin was very strong on that pluralistic aspect of liberalism, and so...
Which is different from the belief that society must have the one strong religious or philosophical view about what's true about the big questions of life. liberalism is, in a sense, modest about those questions.
It is
too.
indeed. And I don't think we're anywhere near kind of the European wars of religion in terms of mass wars. Like, we've got terrorist incidents and conflicts, but not at that scale. But those ideas of tolerance that kind of emerge over time, I think, are critical to.
But there are parts in the world which there are religious wars going on.
Exactly.
At the time of recording, the example of the war between Iran and Israel through its proxies, that's both political, but it's also deeply religious in some ways.
Yeah, and the persecution of Christians in some of those lands as well has had a religious aspect.
So I guess one of the questions is then, and I don't know the answer to this one, can you be, maybe I do know, can you have liberal societies which are not with a history in Christendom?
I think we've got some interesting examples in Asia, which are kind of not Western liberalism,
yes,
but have many parallels. And interestingly, with very minimal explicit liberal ideology, but partly through imitation of the West, partly just through the changed nature of their societies as their economies develop, you can actually see quite a lot of parallels in the way they live compared to Europe. Perhaps with still stronger family and collective structures than we do have in Europe or America, but nevertheless, stronger parallels to the West today than, say, their own histories 300 years ago.
The enemy of liberalism is what then? What does anti-liberalism look like then? Or is it also as multifaceted?
It is as multifaceted
as liberalism itself is.
Yeah. So I think in some parts of the world it's religious fervour. In other parts of the world it's a kind of an overbearing, intolerant state, authoritarian states. It's got lots of different adversaries.
At the moment, it looks like autocracies are having a bit of a comeback, which I didn't expect. I thought that liberalism would work so well that people would naturally go that way, but not so.
I think that's true. Like, the worst autocracies are in countries that never had strong liberal traditions. But
That's fair enough.
But you could argue that kind of the legitimation of liberalism has been the success of liberal societies. Most people never knew the abstract principles and signed up to them. And sort of as the economy has deteriorated, etc., you go through these cycles where other forces become more powerful.
That's a very important point, I think, your claim you're making there. The legitimation of liberalism is in the effects in society, not in first principles. And therefore, if life's not as good as it used to be, it's very easy to reach for a more autocratic proposed solution.
Yeah, I think you've seen kind of these crises of capitalism, sort of particularly in the 1930s, where you did have very powerful left-wing movements and totalitarian movements in Europe basically do destroy liberalism for a while. But then, in the post-war period, in a different form, liberalism revives itself.
Does liberalism almost need the failure of autocracies or the alternative to get life? Because it seems to me the great enthusiasm for liberal principles occurs in the face of autocratic regimes or in the face of overwhelming intolerant religious regimes. And when things are going fairly well, we all relax.
Yeah. Like in the Cold War period, the contrast between East and West Germany was a classic example where you're starting with essentially the same culture, same country, yet two incredibly different paths that they took. Got North and South Korea, these great kind of natural experiments in going down different paths. And for a while in Europe, that was a powerful legitimation of the capitalist welfare state that we saw in Western Europe. Now we've got whole generations who've got no memory of East Germany, never known it even existed. You haven't got those contrasts anymore. And we see socialism, which had seemingly been discredited by the early 1990s, coming back into fashion.
It seems to me that liberalism's humility, as you understand it, requires a certain refusal to try and get the perfect answer to things. It's a kind of, this is the best we can get, rather than let's find the solution to the human dilemma and make a society that's really perfect. That's totally alien to the liberal approach, isn't it?
I think there's a strong anti-utopian element. I think the kind of, maybe on the libertarian fringe, there's a utopian element.
Let's talk about the libertarian fringe. That's twice now you've distinguished liberalism from libertarianism. What's the distinction as you understand it?
I've got into trouble with this before, but I think
Please, this is where you get into trouble quite freely here. Don't worry.
libertarianism to me is axiomatic reasoning. Liberty is the top principle, everything is, or property rights is the top principle, and everything else is just logically derived from that. And so even though I sometimes find myself on the same broad side of contemporary debates as libertarians, I do believe that trying to extract everything from those foundational principles sort of goes against kind of the
So
value.
there is a kind of dogmatic liberalism.
Yeah.
That's what you mean by libertarianism, just as there could be a dogmatic collectivism.
And both sides attract certain personality types, so it's, there is this link between personality and beliefs.
Now, liberalism has been criticised as ignoring some important parts of the human problem. One is liberal societies seem to ignore the massive disparities that can occur in wealth and in power. That's why we need a strong government or a strong to correct these problems. What do you say to those critiques?
Strangely enough, I think early liberalism was partly a revolt against a more feudal society where these status differences were locked in. So I think we've always had a more fluid version of society than that, but it is true you get these extremely wide gaps between the rich and the poor in liberal societies. And in some ways the welfare state has been sort of the institution that helps deal with some of that, though not so much necessarily on inequality, but at the extreme ends of poverty. And I guess this is probably where my thinking has evolved most since I first sort of took these ideas sort of in the early 1980s. I'm actually much more sympathetic to the welfare state now than I was back then, even though people like Friedman had negative income taxes, just because I think it does remove some of the risks and sort of evens out some of the life course ups and downs in income and consumption needs.
You haven't mentioned, I don't think, in your list, the freedom of the individual, individualism. You may have been thinking it, haven't said it. Is that crucial to liberalism as you understand it?
I think it is, but it's probably a slightly different individualism to what I see in contemporary society, which is just that, my individual rights trump everything else.
Right.
I think where I'd see classical liberalism as being perhaps pluralist, in the sense that it recognises lots of different groups in society, and for those to preserve themselves often requires an element of exclusion. If you don't believe in my religion or whatever it is, you can't join.
Fair enough.
And to me, now where people demand to be able to join everything, regardless of whether they actually fit with the views of the existing group, I think that's where you get this, what some people call hyper-individualism, which I think is different from the liberalism that I subscribe to.
Yes, there are issues, I think, in Western society, a lot of it, in the past anyway, it's been around the sexual revolution and different understandings of human sexuality, which has changed remarkably in the last 50, 60 years. There are still what I call recalcitrant minorities, maybe not minorities, who hold a very different view, almost always, but not entirely, religious organisations who to maintain their life will need to provide certain practice that others regard as intolerable, distinguishing people, judging people on their sexual behaviour and so forth. So that's where we have a contrast between the community to exist and the liberal society that it exists in.
And so I'm in favour of generally of allowing the group to decide who its members are going to be. That's kind of where I would differ from other
The group
forms
can
of
decide.
Yeah.
There's a limit to that though, isn't there, still?
I think there are kind of in more extreme cases, and also Jacob Levy, who's a Canadian political theorist who I like a lot, like he says, in some ways you've got to contextualise this more broadly.
Right.
That if a particular group is being terribly oppressed in society, there may be a case for sort of anti-discrimination or that just breaks open some of these barriers. But if there are general freedoms for this group in the society, use sort of the gay and lesbian example, accepted in 99% of institutions without question, is there any great need to sort of deal with the remaining religious organisations that might object to it? I think he would say no, and I would agree with him.
Would he say the same about race?
Possible, probably not. It's kind of a more sensitive one. But you do get the issue of, for example, organisations designed for people of a particular ethnic background, which I don't think are hugely problematic.
I guess you do. Now, you've been involved in the university sector for quite a while, and you still survived. Well, almost.
Yeah.
Are university liberal organisations, or are they illiberal organisations?
Well, universities are quite pluralist, really. Like, there's a lot of different beliefs at universities, and I think if I had one criticism of the way that university is perceived externally, is there's a lot of focus on left-wing activity in arts or education faculties, when the majority of academics are more on the science side, doing something quite different, which doesn't necessarily engage with these issues. And so there's a lot of attention on the activities of the university, which are not actually the dominant thing they do day to day.
So therefore they may be unduly criticised as being illiberal.
Yeah, and I think it's very hard to quantify this, but I think there definitely was quite a professional ethos at universities when I was there in the 1980s, where the fact that I didn't agree politically with my teaching staff didn't make any difference. I never felt there was any case of me being discriminated against, whereas I do feel that happens anecdotally sometimes today. I don't think it's the norm, but it probably happens more often than it did in the past.
Because the perception is that the kind of views you put forward, favouring less government than others, trusting the society more, being humble in what can be achieved by government and other programs, this is not the prevailing ethos at the university in the teaching.
Probably in certain disciplines, no, but probably on the science side, there is probably more modesty about what can be achieved, because I think if you're an empirical discipline, that puts certain constraints on you.
When evidence can contradict you,
exactly,
you've got to be more careful what you say.
Yeah, and I think even it's kind of, in the social sciences where there is still an empirical tradition, that puts a brake on what you will say because you simply can't prove it.
So the problem is unfalsifiable claims, unevidential claims. That's where it's free range.
This has got some weird historical parallels in the university history, I think, because they start off generally being founded by religious orders.
Yes.
And we do have institutional autonomy from quite an early period. So that was kind of freedom of the institution to express religious views. But it wasn't academic freedom in the sense that we know it today, which is an individual power. You still had to stick with the scholarship. You could dispute what a passage in the Bible meant, but you couldn't say that God.
And when you say we, you're talking about the medieval origins.
Medieval origins of the system, whereas I think a criticism of the universities now is, at least in some disciplines, we've almost gone back to that original model that you can argue about the interpretation of this or that thinker, but you can't really totally question what the discipline is about.
Right. Where do you think liberalism, it's hard, I preface this question, it's always very hard to know for where one sits today. Things always seem bigger and more dangerous. It's the presentism. The present day seems the big day. Every election is the big election. But do you think liberalism is in some sense under threat or in decline at the moment? Is it genuinely in question, or is it just just part of the ongoing ebb and flow of life?
I think it's probably mostly ebb and flow, but like we are in this period where there are unusual social conflicts compared to the recent past. There is a period in the economy which is still quite prosperous, but less prosperous than it has been in the past. And so we kind of are losing sort of mass belief that the system is working in the interests of most people. And that is always a time when other people become open to other ideas that might solve these problems. In some ways, the revival of classical liberalism, say in the 1980s, was a consequence of economic failures in the 1970s. So these things do move in cycles.
Yeah, in fact, I've got a theory about this, that you get somewhat bored of what you've got, or the natural limitations come about, or external factors affect it, and therefore you lose heart, try something else, swing back to more statism, which normally doesn't end happily. So you reinvent liberalism again.
So you could argue in kind of a post-liberal phase at the moment, but it clearly isn't going well. In my view, won't go well.
Right.
And there will be some reaction against that. I can't say what it'll be. I can't say whether it'll be mainly liberal, but probably there will be some reaction against it.
So you're a long-term optimist then about liberalism?
Probably, mainly because I think it works for understandable, good reasons, and even though it can get imbalanced, at times, I don't think the underlying society has changed in ways that make it no longer suitable for a liberal society.
And internationally?
There I'm probably more pessimistic in the sense that I think clearly in some parts of the world the anti-liberal forces have certainly got political power and there's not much organisation against them. Like all these regimes will fall at some point, as history suggests, but what will replace them, who knows?
And yes, and there have been attempts, we started with this, hurriedly to impose liberalism, which is actually at times almost given it a bad name.
Yeah, I think so, because you set up expectations that cannot be met.
So here we have a philosophy of life which is not based on much other than it works, which low expectations, and you expect that to win.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
That's right.
An unenthusiastic enthusiast for liberalism.
Thank you.
My guest today has been Andrew Norton, who's been heavily involved in the tertiary sector here in Australia and is a modest liberal. I'm Rob Forsyth. This is Liberalism in Question from the Centre for Independent Studies. Thank you for watching.